people living in poor areas who may not have access to really good education or may not be able to speak English particularly well are less proficient at putting their viewpoints across. And I think that there needs to be widespread publication of their viewpoints so that those viewpoints compete at the same level internationally.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Most people outside Africa probably don't associate trophy hunting with conservation. In fact, certain publicized incidents of trophy hunting have caused something of a global moral panic. The same often goes for the culling of animal populations to manage their numbers and the trade in ivory, even ivory harvested from elephants that die naturally. In today's discussion, we get into these perceptions, and my guest explains why they may be misguided. Lochran Traill is a lecturer at the University of Leeds. He's a conservation biologist and, having grown up in Zimbabwe, specializes in African ecology and conservation. Among the many topics he's researched and published on in top journals is the aforementioned trophy hunting. Our discussion focuses on, but is not limited to, his most recent paper on divergent views on trophy hunting in Africa, especially between people within and outside the continent. I started off by asking Lochran how his research focus landed on this particular topic.
I think that I'm now involved in these questions because I become aware of issues around those voices not being promoted or heard. And that's just partly through my own life experience. So growing up in Zimbabwe, I was exposed to two different forms of conservation. So one is the fortress type conservation, which is national parks. Mm-hmm. The other is community-based conservation that happens on communal land. And I guess the third type of conservation is on private land, although much of that land now is communal land. So I was witness to that and grew up in a country where conservation wasn't just only on national parks. But then, like a lot of people who left school, I took a gap year and I worked on a conservation area before I then went on to study. Mm-hmm. So I took a year off after my A-levels at school. And that conservation area was actually forestry land in Zimbabwe, so it's not a traditional form of conservation. Forestry land that was given over to conservation, but what happened on that particular protected area was actually hunting, trophy hunting. Mm-hmm. This is in the 1990s, early 90s. It wasn't in any way controversial then. Mm-hmm. And I didn't go there and work there because of hunting. It had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. I was interested in experience in conservation and wildlife management and land management. And so that's what I did. I was actively involved in day-to-day conservation and wildlife management, which is maintaining of roads and maintaining the camps and so on. But hunting didn't really enter my mind then. I was only vaguely aware of it, but I did witness clients come onto the property and go out hunting with a professional hunter, and I joined them once actually on a day hunt.
Can I just interrupt you to ask you to give a bit of a definition of trophy hunting? So you mentioned also that the presence of a professional hunter, which is something I had forgotten about. Actually, that's kind of one key component of it. But can you sort of just to the layperson just outline what trophy hunting means as a particular kind of hunting?
So in Southern Africa, anyways, the professional hunter was in Zimbabwe. There would be a person who's trained to take a client out hunting. And it used to be a 2-year apprenticeship, and that involved handling the weapons and tracking and first aid and a number of different things. And it was quite a long apprenticeship. And it was something that was open to working class people that may not have had the opportunity to go to university. Mm. Typically, they from Africa and they have a very good understanding of bushveld. And they would take the client out and basically place the client where the client can shoot that animal. Mm-hmm. So that's a professional hunter, and they have a very good understanding of the countryside and of the animal behavior and of dangerous situations. They know how to hunt, and they just basically take the client and then step aside. And the professional hunter's there too to make sure that
the client's safe.
Yes, as backup for any dangerous situations. Of course, there are many dangerous situations because they're shooting large, dangerous game, which are all dangerous, and especially dangerous when they've been wounded.
Yeah.
And the client is basically, for the large game anyways, they pay a lot of money. So someone typically overseas who is affluent enough to pay substantial fees for each trophy, but also the entire hunt, which may be 14 days or 21 days, itself is expensive.
And then trophy hunting, that means basically hunting for the purpose of being able to display what's been hunted, right? As opposed to hunting for meat, which I guess would be the other main form of hunting.
So yes, it's hunting for a trophy, which is typically taxidermied and exported and imported to a country of origin, and that may be, let's say, a male buffalo that's exhibited a large boss and horns, or let's say an antelope species like a sable antelope, also again typically a male, that would also exhibit a large set of horns, or a lion, for example, that would exhibit a large mane.
Yeah.
So that's trophy hunting. Then hunting for meat is something different. So hunting for meat does happen, well, obviously illegally, which is kind of what used to be traditional hunting, but now happens illegally for bushmeat. But then in South Africa, there is something called biltong hunting, where people do go and shoot plains game, and then that's taken home as meat.
Right.
What you'd see in the media and so on, and what seems to antagonize a lot of people, is the hunting for trophies, which is typically of large game animals.
It sounds like the trophy hunting, considering the fact that people will be after quite specific animals and also all of the additional costs that are involved, it sounds like a much more expensive and lucrative endeavor than normal hunting for meat, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the numbers are published, but off the top of my head, an elephant trophy would be over $20,000. And then the actual safari or operation where they go out and hunt over 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that would be expensive. So $500 or more a night. But those figures, those are just numbers off the top of my head. You can go online and have a look at those. But yes, there is a lot of money that is spent on securing a trophy. And yes, the offtake is low relative to, let's say, certainly illegal hunting for bushmeat, but the offtake is low even for cropping.
What's that? What's offtake?
Offtake would be the removal of individuals from a population.
Okay.
So for trophy hunting, the killing of animals from a population would typically be just a few. It's all based on a quota, so just a few individuals of each species each year. And not always, but typically removal of older males from a population. But it doesn't always happen, unfortunately. But where that does happen, then there is evidence to suggest that if those males have already are past their prime, so they're senescent and they've already bred, well, the impact is not going to be, the genetic impact is not going to be substantial.
Right, okay.
But it doesn't always happen. And also what may happen is that younger males are removed from a population, which then does have a genetic effect. But it is true to say that if done correctly, the impact is not substantial on the population. It may affect animals' behavior. And it is true to say that, yes, it does generate fairly substantial income and with relatively low impact. And I think that's what stuck with me, is that it was a place called Sijirira in Zimbabwe. I worked there, as I said, as a volunteer, and thought nothing of it. I was only interested in getting experience in conservation that helped me then go on to study, and saw it as nothing more than that. But what stayed with me is that it more or less did work. The impact was low. They were the only time clients or people other than the people living on the property, which was the senior management staff, which I just worked under, and then the junior staff. The only time there were people other than that small amount of people on the property was when a professional hunter with his or her client came onto the property, which was only over a certain period of year. Basically, forget the season now, I think it was the dry season in Zimbabwe, but basically 3 or 4 months a year. Then it was really quiet. And so there wasn't much impact at all. And there's basically a large area with just one camp for those clients and an airstrip, and they would fly in and fly out. Admittedly, it was subsidized, but it worked. It was a protected area that worked. The vegetation was and still is entirely intact, the native vegetation. The animal population was intact. What was somewhat affected was their behavior. So they were somewhat more skittish, I guess is the word, than than would be animals that you'd see in a protected area given over to photographic tourism. But other than that, from a conservation perspective, the area was maintained and intact. And so that stayed with me as an example of something of a form of conservation wildlife management, I guess, more specifically, that worked before it became controversial. But at that same time, that year when I took a year off before studying, because I was a volunteer and I was very enthusiastic, I was then linked up with other people who worked with a campfire program in Zimbabwe, and I did some volunteer work with them. And I was then also witness to conservation that happened in communal lands, and saw that happen where hunting was also, again, part of the management model.
Also trophy hunting, or was it?
Yes, those regions did generate income through trophy hunting. There was human-wildlife conflict, there were issues, but I did experience conservation within communal lands, with all the issues that come with that. But I saw a lot of wildlife in those communal lands. So I was then exposed to communal conservation and the campfire program, which is fairly well known in Zimbabwe, at a young age. And that has always stayed with me. And I was, like I say, I was witness to the many issues that arise. So conflict with the communities and conservation authorities, human-wildlife conflict. There were many issues, but still the wildlife populations were more or less intact, even elephant populations within communal lands.
So it sounds like, you pointed out that obviously there can be conservation issues if the animals that are taken out are too young, for example, the skittishness of the animals. So it is kind of partly a management issue, which can be done better or worse, but overall it sounds like a potentially good management tool. But it seems like the big uproar about trophy hunting in particular is not about conservation. It's more about animal welfare and perceptions of animal rights. And I know that you have written recently about the differing attitudes towards trophy hunting, which, as far as I understand, are mostly in that area. They're kind of more on the emotional side of the spectrum rather than the practical and management-oriented side of the spectrum.
Yes, so kind of go back to what you said initially there. The model of trophy hunting itself is not all that bad, as long as it's tightly regulated, it's based on quotas, and only senescent individuals are taken out of the population. Then the model itself is not bad. But of course, people being people, there is bad management practice that happens on the ground. And that's what's highlighted. And yes, I think the core issue around trophy hunting that people have outside of Africa and even inside of Africa is that it's basically killing for pleasure or killing for a trophy to take that trophy home. And I think that there may be some bad behavior and by clients or hunters themselves. And I think maybe images that you'd see of people posing with a dead animal tend to antagonize a lot of people. So yes, there are welfare concerns and there are different philosophies towards conservation. North America may have a model that's more similar to Africa, but certainly my experience in Europe is that it's more what you would call the protectionist approach. So more interested in protecting populations and having no form of use of those populations, and particularly not killing them for pleasure. But from my experience and what I can understand in Africa is that it's more a philosophy of sustainable use. So people live alongside wildlife and they've always actually used those wildlife populations for food. So pre-colonial times, animals are always hunted for food. And there is very much a philosophy within communal lands across Southern Africa that use of animals is acceptable, sustainable use, hopefully. And it's acceptable philosophically. There's no issues around that. And so trophy hunting just fits within that, where it is tolerated as one form of use of wildlife populations. And so those people that are exposed to daily conflict with those animals, they'll accept those interactions with those animals where they gain something from those wildlife populations. And that will be typically meat, but also if there's money generated, like through trophy hunting or even photographic tourism. Because those poor people, this is fairly well known, like a cost benefit. Those poor communities living alongside wildlife, they incur the costs of conservation.
Right, yeah.
So not only the costs through conflict, which may be destruction of crops or killing of livestock, and also even killing of people too, and injury of people. Substantial costs, but also opportunity costs. So that is the land that is set aside for conservation could be used for agriculture. So they lose out on that opportunity. But people outside of Africa, or even in urban areas in Africa, incur no costs at all.
Right.
But people outside of Africa or wealthy people in urban areas in Africa enjoy the benefits, and those benefits will be photographic tourism mostly. So they have to incur some benefit, absolutely, and this is why Campfire started. And Campfire's been around in Zimbabwe since the early 80s, or even late 1970s. This is why there were conservationists who I think were ahead of their time in that country. But I only talk of Zimbabwe because that's my experience. But the same, I think, can be said of Namibia and Zambia, and to some extent South Africa too. But they understood that, and they realized that there had to be some form of benefit, and benefit would mostly be financial. And so how can money be generated? Well, there's two ways: photographic tourism and trophy hunting. And not all communal lands are exceptionally pretty. There's a lot of them are fairly arid and dry and flat. So people paying for their once-in-a-lifetime holiday to Africa are not going to go to fairly remote areas where they may also see some people, and dry and arid areas. They will go to splendid areas. It's like Kruger National Park or Okavango, for example, or Saimara. But trophy hunters aren't particularly concerned about that. They want to go and get a trophy. So that's how trophy hunting is used as one model to generate income. But within the broader framework of conservation, and I guess the broader philosophical framework of use of animal populations is acceptable. And trophy hunting, not only does it generate income, but also provides meat. So meat is highly valued to those local people.
All right.
Oh, and then you mentioned how some of the work that I've done lately has shown some divergent opinions.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask if you could, talk about this recent paper that you and co-authors put out, looking at the different attitudes from different parts of the world and how they differ. You've already mentioned North America, Africa, and Europe, but if you could maybe go into a bit more detail there.
Yeah, the paper, yes, I think last year, so yes, 2021, published in Conservation Letters. That was basically a social survey. That survey didn't reach those very poor communities, I must say, but that was a survey circulated through email and online, so collecting very simple parameters, so asking people's age, gender identity, ethnicity, as well as location, importantly. And then, and also were they employed in conservation or had a conservation background or not. And then just a set of questions around, did they support hunting or not? Were they supportive of a ban on hunting or not? And were they supportive of outside funding? So if hunting was phased out in Southern Africa.
Were you asking specifically about trophy hunting?
Yes, yeah. And so the questionnaire at the outset made it explicitly said this is about trophy hunting in Africa, and specifically about large game to differentiate it from biltong hunting, for example. And that was circulated through all the contacts that I have, as well as all the co-authors circulated that widely amongst their networks, and also various mail lists at universities, wildlife management mail lists, and so on.
And this was amounting to, if I remember correctly, more than 5,000 respondents, right? So it's quite a big pool.
Yes, so 5,500. And then we did some fairly standard statistical interpretation of that. And by having fairly basic response questions, do you support hunting or not? Do you support a ban or not? You can then tease out what is driving the response across the respondents, so the demographics of those respondents. And what clearly emerged is that there's a divergent opinion. So people in Europe were significantly more opposed to hunting than people based in Africa, and that would be mostly Southern Africa and English-speaking countries. Respondents in North America were actually more aligned to people in Africa. We did get some samples from South America and Australia, and also Asia, but those are quite small. We tried what we could, but most of the respondents came from North America, Europe, and Africa, so we mostly focused on those. So there was quite divergent opinion by location, and that's clearly cultural, but then also age. So people under 30 were somewhat less supportive, particularly in Europe. Gender identity too, so male more supportive generally of trophy hunting. And interestingly, conservation backgrounds. So people, any respondents that had some affiliation with conservation or a degree or diploma in conservation, wildlife conservation or wildlife management, were significantly more supportive of trophy hunting in Africa. But also there were some, when we explored those data further, some interesting patterns, like I talked about demographics. So in Europe, there was very much a pronounced difference between, let's say, older and younger, and also like male and female. But in Africa, all of those groups were much more close together. But those patterns I know to be true generally by just talking and interacting with people. Of course, there'll be some distribution across those data. So let's say, for example, it's not entirely true to say everyone in Europe is opposed. Of course, there'll be people in Europe that are supportive of hunting, and there'll be people in Africa that are strongly opposed to hunting. But the means are different. And in my experience of traveling to Africa and, well, obviously living and traveling in Africa, but also now living in Europe, is that those patterns do hold. There are cultural differences, clear cultural differences. People are influenced by their upbringing and many influences are around them, particularly when they're raised. That study didn't include any voices from communal lands, but there actually have been some papers published and surveys of people, very poor people living in communal lands, on their views, and almost unanimously there's support for trophy hunting as a form of wildlife management. And where there is opposition, from what I can tell, it's where there has been some dispute with the contractor. So the professional hunter or contractor, there's been some dispute with them and they're not happy with that particular person. So I ended up getting involved in this whole debate after Cecilgate or Cecil the Lion happened. And I was actually...
I think maybe a lot of listeners won't know what that was all about.
So that happened, Cecilgate, I think, was it 2013? A lion, resident mostly in Rangi National Park in Zimbabwe, given the name Cecil, was hunted on an area outside of the national park. But in actual fact, I know that area, and there's no fence. There's actually just a rail line that designates the national park from a hunting area. And apparently the animal was lured out of that. We don't know really what happened on the ground, but lured out with a bait out of the national park. The only thing that was illegal about that was that the land on which it happened, where the animal was shot, didn't have a hunting permit. So it wasn't a legal process. But what also happened is that animal happened to have a GPS collar fitted. And that collar was owned by researchers at the University of Oxford, and they noticed fairly quickly that the animal was no longer moving, and followed up and found out that the animal had been killed and reported it. I think because they knew that, I can't speak for them, but I think because they knew that the hunter didn't have a permit in that particular lot of land. But it was then released to the media in the UK, and it quickly spiraled almost out of control, and almost the entire world was talking about Cecil the Lion for a brief period of time. A lot of people got drawn into that. And I got drawn in somehow in that I was asked to do an interview because I do work on large mammals and conservation. And there's a radio station at university. I was based at University of Witwatersrand then in Johannesburg in South Africa. And there's a student radio station, I forgot the name of it, but I was interviewed by one of the students. That student was a Black African student. And one thing that stuck with me is he said, why is there so much concern about an animal that's being killed? This is an animal that ostensibly is dangerous to communities. Why is there so much concern? And that stuck with me, and I had to try and explain, but I didn't give a good explanation. And this is a major criticism that's around the debate around trophy hunting, is that people from outside of Africa are far more concerned about animals than they are about people. And an obsession too with trophy hunting. So lions are killed all the time through problem animal control, conflict with people, even killed illegally. And that doesn't generate much concern. But when a hunting client kills an animal, then it generates global concern. So there's a substantial double standard. But what stuck with me was that the interviewer repeatedly said to me, we don't understand why people from outside of Africa are so concerned about this. And it's a valid point. And that did show that there are very clear cultural differences and issues around this. And I think that those differences really need to be explored. All the evidence suggests many papers published on communal views, many people that I've talked to, even some work that I've done recently, the evidence suggests that people think differently around hunting, but also more broadly, not just hunting, but use of wildlife populations. There's an opportunity, well, not an opportunity, but I think that there's a broader role to be played in elevating the views of people that are most affected by conservation in Africa, and those are the people living alongside. In actual fact, conservationists have been concerned about those people for quite a while. I'm not coming to this, nothing that I do is particularly novel. That's how this campfire started up in Zimbabwe. People realized that those poor people were left out, and if they weren't brought to the fore, they were going to remove all those animals, and it would be bad for conservation. So we're basically still there, but I think now we have the world as a smaller place. Social media has substantial influence, and I think that we almost have to go back to the beginning and say, well, if you don't account for the views and the philosophies of people most affected by wildlife, particularly of these poor people that live alongside wildlife, if you don't account for those views and ensure that they are heard and that they benefit from conservation, then they will poach out all of these animals, and conservation as itself, as a movement, will fail. And I think most people recognize that, but I think it's been drowned out in these big debates where it's very obvious that there's philosophical differences around hunting as a conservation tool. But there is now some slow recognition. There hasn't been any recognition that those differences in opinion may be cultural, and there is bias. And I think people in Europe, for example, may not be fully aware that they bring their own culture to these debates, and that their own bias has to be accounted for. There's been up until very recently, no discussion around that. There's substantial influence of people from the global north, because they're relatively more affluent and resident at very good universities and do some great research. And there's a lot of really good research that happens in Africa by people from outside of Africa, and the ecological research is fantastic. But research in ecology and work in ecology is different from conservation policy. So that's quite a different thing. And so when those same people, or people whose origins may not be local, then develop policy or try and impose their views through policy, such as, thou shalt not hunt. That's an imposition of a value system from another place. And there's no consideration of that at all, those cultural differences.
The people, especially Europeans, who are kind of expressing the kind of anti-hunting sentiment and the concern about Cecil the lion being shot and that kind of thing, my guess is that there are people who would probably be supporting various causes, not specifically the environment. It seems like a sort of a cultural indicator, and maybe an indicator of a society or a group of people who are simply quite far removed from the realities of what's happening on the ground. And I think one thing that might support that assumption is you mentioned that, you sort of alluded to it here, but you also mentioned in a separate conversation that within Africa, not with your study, but comparing your study with others, that there was sort of a convergence of opinion, a pro-hunting opinion between the more privileged and the less privileged sectors of society, the elites and the rural communities. There was a fair amount of convergence within Africa, but then this very different point of view, especially from the European side of things.
Yes, because they are better informed. I don't think that, as you say, I don't think many people in Europe know what trophy hunting in Africa is. Even though, funny enough, hunting, I think some European countries, I could be wrong, actually have banned hunting. But hunting does occur in Europe, even in the United Kingdom, England, where I am. There is, I think they call it stalking, but deer are shot. But yes, I think many people don't really know what trophy hunting in Africa is. They, in particular, may not be aware that it contributes towards conservation or community development. There is criticism, by the way, that not all of that money goes back towards conservation community development, which is true. There are issues around corruption. In many places that is true, that the money doesn't necessarily go back to the people, the poor people who live alongside the wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I think that there's a lack of understanding. And I do think there is also an attitude that because this happens in Africa, I think that people outside of Africa may think that they have a say somehow in what goes on there. There's certainly a deep affection for African wildlife and for large animals, which is great. But there seems to be an implicit assumption that the people outside of Africa have a say in policy and what happens in Africa, where that doesn't so much exist for, let's say, Asia. So there are megafauna in Asia, there are elephant in Asia, there's large cats. I think there is some trophy hunting in Asia, but I don't know if it's as widespread as it is in Africa. But there doesn't seem to be much involvement of Western countries in developing conservation policy in India, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe Africans themselves could say, well, actually, they're the principal decision makers. Of course, there's a substantial amount of aid given towards conservation in Africa. That should by no means stop. Obviously, there's a lot of tourists that visit Africa to see wildlife, and it's a great natural asset. But I do think that potentially there should be some further voice given to the people most affected by conservation in Africa, which are the poor people that either live with wildlife in communal lands where there are wildlife populations resident, or they live outside of protected areas where there still is some conflict.
Yeah.
And I think that those people are certainly included in policy within those countries, but at an international level, there's some less consideration of them and their viewpoints and also their philosophical differences.
And this sort of phenomenon is not restricted to trophy hunting, right? That's the topic that you've been looking into recently, but it's not the only example.
Yes. So certainly in Southern Africa, I think what it comes down to, is in Southern Africa, I can't speak, of course, for East or West Africa. I've never been there, but there is a general acceptance of use of wildlife. So use of wildlife, would include the killing of animals, obviously, and the use of their products. And wildlife use or utilization, that's a philosophy that's widely accepted, and it's acceptable to very poor people living in those communal lands. They've used wildlife pre-colonial times. Now, trophy hunting is just one manifestation. The practice has some colonial origins, but it's lasted as long as it has because it's just a form of use. But yes, I think that these are philosophical differences. And yes, there are other forms of wildlife use that are unpalatable to people outside of Africa, and that is culling. So culling for meat, but just culling generally to restrict populations where there may be where their densities may have increased to unsustainable levels. And yes, now I can't comment authoritatively at all about ivory trade, but I know that there is a fairly strong support in Southern Africa for the sale of ivory. And that ivory, by the way, is not taken from animals that are specifically killed at all for the ivory. A lot of that ivory is collected from animals that die naturally and then collected and stored, or animals that are killed through problem animal control. But there are substantial stores of ivory across Southern Africa, and there's widespread support. Obviously, there is some opposition, but much support by people for the selling of that ivory. And ostensibly, that money would then go back into conservation. But it's interesting because there's obviously quite different views around this. And I think in the future, this is something that could come to the fore. It's not something I know much about or feel strongly about at all. I know that the major criticism about illegal trade in ivory, worked ivory that is then used to create trinkets and so on, is that where there's illegal trade, well, then it's very easy to then trade an illegal product that's just basically shipped with the legal product, right? So I think that's a valid criticism. Issues around corruption and lack of management. There isn't a reason why people want to actively encourage trade in ivory. Maybe it'd be better to actively discourage it, which is where we're going right now, it seems. But equally, from what I can tell, the number of elephants poached over the past decade has increased substantially. And so that ban on ivory doesn't seem to have had a substantial influence. The animals that have been poached over the past decade or two, mostly around East Africa and West Africa, they are killed illegally for their ivory, which is then traded illegally.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I can't comment any more than that because I don't know the details. But it does seem to me that, let's say, culling for meat and culling generally, and also the trade in ivory, as well as trophy hunting, are just forms of wildlife use that are acceptable to people within Southern Africa. But it seems that those are strongly opposed by people outside of Africa.
Mm-hmm. So I'm still kind of wondering, it does seem like there's a kind of a conflation of animal welfare on the one hand and sustainable use on the other hand. So, if we were to find out tomorrow that there was a way of conducting trophy hunting, like a foolproof formula that would guarantee benefits for communities and for conservation, and maybe the same thing for ivory, I guess that there would still be a lot of opposition to it because people kind of conflate these two issues. But I guess the question is kind of, what's to be done about that?
It's a tricky one. It's interesting that I've been in the UK now for 5, coming up 6 years, and I've actually, over that entire period, every year, I've given a lecture to young British students on trophy hunting. What I do is outline to them what trophy hunting is, as I explained at the beginning of this chat.
Mm-hmm.
And then I explain to them the positive and negative aspects of trophy hunting. The negative aspects are actually not entirely around welfare. That's what's given a lot of attention in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But the negative aspects would be genetic, so evolutionary effects, and demographics, so removing too many individuals, as well as issues around corruption. The positive effects of trophy hunting are that there's income generated and it helps people tolerate wildlife populations.
Mm-hmm.
But every time that I've given this lecture, so I've given the same lecture 6 times over 6 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, every time that I give the lecture, there are students that come up to me after the lecture and say, "Thank you so much. We actually never knew that." And I don't know what they expected of me when I walked into the class to give the lecture, but I can guarantee just something quite different to what they actually had, because they simply have not had someone whose origins are African stand in front of them and tell them what trophy hunting in Africa actually is. And actually quite confidently say, and these are the positives around trophy hunting as well as the negatives. And it's always been very well received, because generally I can see the change in their facial expression too. They come away from that suddenly aware that this is far more nuanced than they expected, and far more complicated, like a lot of things. And it's a very grey issue. It's not black and white. And they were never aware of this. And I always point towards a lot of papers that cover all of this, and they go away and read those papers, and they very much appreciate that. But I think that one key issue is, where do people get the information? So I think there'll be a profound, young people are young people wherever they are. They have the same concerns and so on and so forth. But I can pretty much guarantee young people within Southern Africa, let's say South Africa, would have some viewpoints on trophy hunting, but that the mean would be different. There would be a greater understanding of how it's a far more complicated issue than what is portrayed by, let's say, the media.
Because they've quite a sizable proportion of them have had first-hand experience, do you think?
Yes, and also through discussion and culture, which is basically cultural too, discussion with people. They'll be familiar with people, know people that may hunt. They may have family or friends that live in rural areas that may hunt. But young people, from what I can tell, in a place like Europe, they get the information from quite different places. And they see these images of people posing with dead animals, and obviously that is not a nice image, and that's all they see, and they can't see anything beyond that. They can't understand how that possibly can be linked to conservation, how it can possibly be a good thing. I think it's quite antagonistic and foolish of people to take images of themselves with dead animals and then post those images online and so on. I'm not a hunter myself. I don't own a gun. I don't hunt. I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to hunt at any point in my lifetime. But I think that there's things that they do that antagonize a lot of people, and that is certainly one of them. But yes, I think the young people, from my experience in Britain, I don't know where they get the information from, but they're not getting it from the same places as people in Southern Africa.
Mm.
But they quite quickly change their minds around the issue. And also, when they too realize that as a practice it may contribute towards conservation, that may be supported by poor people, then that quickly changes their opinion on some matters, when they realize that actually the philosophies are different, and actually very poor people who are not in any way privileged don't have an aversion to hunting because they live alongside these wildlife populations.
Yeah, I thought I can imagine that, sort of realizing the relationship with community well-being would be a big one. And then sort of maybe on a more philosophical level, I can imagine also just hearing a balanced view of things. You mentioned that, you're not trying to support things one way or another. And I think that really does help people to form their own opinions. Because if they go into the lecture very much against trophy hunting, and then they come up, they get fed a bunch of information about how great trophy hunting is, and that's all, then they'll probably go away, even more adamantly against it.
It does seem to change their mind, I think, because they, up until that point, they're provided with one perspective only.
Yeah.
And they may be provided with a balanced perspective by me, but I think it's the first time they've ever been exposed to any arguments in favor of hunting.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know the future of trophy hunting. A lot of people have been saying, well, trophy hunting isn't going to last. And there's a part of me that thinks, well, yes, it'll just fizzle out. But I don't know. It's still there. I can't predict the future. Trophy hunting itself is something that I've got to be careful not to be strongly attached to, and I'm mindful of that. I would like to move away from that debate. But I do think that it is quite clear what that debate has done, because of Cecil the Lion and all the attention around trophy hunting that's been published in the scientific literature, but also the media and so on, over the past almost decade since Cecil the Lion was killed. What that debate has done is really brought to the fore that there are fundamental differences in the way that people think, an underlying assumption from people outside of Africa that they have a right in directing policy. I think that they should be able to make a contribution, but implicit assumption that they have the right to direct policy. And I'm now aware that there's fundamental philosophical differences, and those may not be emphasized or fully understood, and there needs to be some promotion of what those are, and certainly a promotion of at an international level of what African philosophies are, what their views are, at the same level as the viewpoints of people in the multi countries who are opposed to hunting, and they tend to be based at really good universities or have a lot of influence and pretty confident with a good education. So they know exactly how to get their viewpoints across. Whereas people living in poor areas who may not have access to really good education or may not be able to speak English particularly well are less proficient at putting their viewpoints across. And I think that there needs to be widespread publication of their viewpoints so that those viewpoints compete at the same level internationally.
Okay, next time I'll be speaking with journalist, best-selling author, and I can't resist mentioning it even though it's not relevant to the discussion, Viscount Matt Ridley. Matt's most recent book, Viral, is about the origins of the COVID pandemic. But I invited him to speak about another interest that we share, which he's dealt with in previous books, environmental alarmism, and to what extent it's justified.